Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. A friendly reminder before we start, the new online event that I'm co-presenting with Dr. Owen Emerson kicks off in less than 2 weeks. It's called The Making of a Queen, Anne Boleyn 1501 to 1522. Through a series of 6 pre-recorded lectures and 1 live Zoom discussion, we'll explore the transformative experiences and interactions that shaped the woman and Queen Anne would become. Participants will also be entered into a very special giveaway and have access to all the recordings for 2 months following the end of the event. For details, head to my website on thetudortrail.com or just Google The Making of a Queen Eventbrite. I do hope you'll consider joining us. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm delighted to be joined by Helena Rutkowska to chat about her fascinating research into William Camden's Annals, the first full-scale history of the reign of Elizabeth I. Helena is in her final year of a collaborative doctoral award between the University of Oxford and the British Library. Her PhD, entitled The First History of Elizabethan England, The Making of William Camden's Annals, focuses on establishing the authorship, sources and intentions behind the creation of the first complete history of Elizabeth I's reign. In 2023, enhanced imaging techniques of the original draft manuscripts at the British Library revealed 65 pages of text that had previously been covered up for 400 years. This discovery and Helena's research has been documented in The Guardian, ITV News and other media outlets. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Helena. How are you?
Hi, Natalie. I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I've been looking forward to our conversation, so I'm excited to dive in. I thought we might just start with an introduction. So if you wouldn't mind just telling our listeners a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm so excited to be here. So my name is Helena Rutkowska and I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Oxford and the British Library. And in fact, I wasn't originally from a Tudor history background, so that's quite interesting. I came to my project in a slightly roundabout way. So I did my undergraduate degree in classics at the University of Durham, and then I ended up doing our art history, curatorship and Renaissance culture master's degree at the Warburg Institute in London. And so sometimes people ask me, how on earth did you end up studying William Camden's Annals, the first history ever written about Elizabeth I? And basically, my main research interest throughout my whole academic journey has been classical reception. So that's kind of studying how later centuries would look back to, the ancient Greek and ancient Roman civilizations and how they were influenced by them. And so when I first came across William Camden's Annals, I was immediately struck that this was a history completely written originally in Latin. And Camden himself in his preface talked about how he'd been influenced by different classical historians. So that's what originally got me to my project, which is officially entitled entitled The First History of Elizabethan England, The Making of William Camden's Annals. But of course, now that I've been doing it for a couple of years, the aim of the thesis has broadened. And what I'm specifically looking at is the authorship, the sources, and the intentions behind the creation of this work. And in particular, what I'm doing is using the original draft manuscripts, and basically those have survived. We're so lucky that often isn't the case for these sort of histories, but they've survived at the British Library. They're known as the Cotten Faustina F manuscripts, and they are about 4,000 pages, bound in 10 volumes, and they show different versions of Camden's history prior to publication. So those questions about authorship, sources, and intentions, I'm really going back to those manuscripts to figure out what's going on there. And of course, naturally, after a few years, I've definitely become a Tudor addict. So it's been a great journey so far.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely love that. And yes, how lucky we are that those manuscripts do survive. So I'm sure that our listeners have probably heard of William Camden if they've been into the Tudor period for a while. But just in case people are new to this area, can you tell us a little bit about who he was? And also, you talked about the fact that he's written this history of the reign of Elizabeth I. When and why does he choose to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Camden is one of those figures that you might have heard of, but not necessarily know his sort of full history. So what I will say is that he was born in London in 1551 to actually a family of modest means. I think his father was part of a painters guild. So, we're not talking about some huge aristocrat or anything like that. But in spite of this, he had a brilliant education, which actually led him to Oxford University, just like myself, in 1566 to 1571. And after his studies there, he gained a position at Westminster School as a teacher, and he was there for over 20 years. And this was a really important period of his life, because not only was he teaching those classical texts that ended up, inspiring and influencing his annals, but he also made many connections with the court. So this is when he became he got in contact with William Cecil, who is obviously Elizabeth's right-hand man, started out as Secretary of State, then the Lord High Treasurer, and they start this really important relationship that ends up being really important when it comes to the creation of the history. But also around this time, Camden kind of identified himself first and foremost as an antiquarian. So he was really interested in British antiquities, and so much so that he and his former pupil, but then later really good friend, Robert Cotton, founded the Society of Antiquaries in 1585, where basically they would look at old monuments and documents from, really early on in Roman Britain to figure out more about what ancient Britain was like. And so actually during that time in Westminster, he wrote what is probably considered one of the most important topographical works on ancient Britain during the early modern period, and it's known as the Britannia. And that was actually published in 6 different editions during his lifetime between 1586 to 1607. So that was a massive passion project for Camden. And so it was only later in 1597 that he left Westminster School, because he got promoted to become Clarenceau King of Arms at the College of Arms, where that must have been a dream job for him, because it basically meant that he was in charge of all matters related to heraldry and genealogy in the kingdom. And he managed to keep that post right up until his death in 1623. But of course, I've just given you a little overview, but where does the annals fit into this? And, why did he start it and when? So like I said, he'd already been fostering a relationship with William Cecil for some time. And it was actually around the same time that he was promoted to Clarenceau King of Arms that William Cecil supposedly asked him to write a history of Elizabeth's reign, which is super interesting considering Elizabeth was still very much alive at this point. So to ask someone to write a history of someone that was still alive, I mean, that's quite a big ask. And basically, we know this information because Camden talks about it quite openly in his preface to the work. And he basically kind of says that Cecil supposedly asked him to do this so that Elizabeth would end up being memorialized properly. But he doesn't really go much into why else, which I think is really, really interesting. But saying, I've just said that it was clearly such a laborious task. Camden then admits quite quickly Cecil died a year later, and he just decided to abandon the project altogether.
Right.
He was like, my industry and my efforts waned. It was too laborious of a task. And so he then simply states that he ended up coming to the project later when Elizabeth had died in 1603, because he felt that no one had done the Queen's memory justice. And he also explained that around that time, his friend, the French historian Jacques Auguste II, was writing history of all sort of recent European affairs. And he noticed that while his friend had made an admirable effort to write all about Europe, there were some key bits missing about Britain. And so Camden felt compelled to publish his annals to kind of rectify some of that. So that's really interesting because that's what Camden tells us in his preface about how he came to the history. But my job and, what other scholars have been really interested in is looking at different pieces of evidence to try and figure out, what is Camden not saying to his reader? And that's been a really interesting process to figure out that kind of composition timeline is a little bit more complicated than he originally sort of tells his reader.
Yeah, that is so interesting. See, that's the sort of information that I think, that context is so important to know that when you're reading the history and you're thinking about how factual parts of it are and all of these sorts of things. So that's absolutely fascinating. So you've talked about the fact that it's a complicated timeline. Do we have any idea when he sort of finished it then, or is that also a bit iffy?
No, so I think this is what's really, really interesting is that I think scholars have debated this depending on what kind of evidence they've been really looking at. So I'm writing a whole chapter on this and it's becoming the longest chapter in my thesis because it is so complicated. Because basically the kind of evidence available to us is sort of the Faustina manuscripts as well as Camden's private correspondence, which we're very fortunate survives. There are a lot of letters, but it is quite confusing to go through the different kind of responses. And so what I will tell you what we do know, and then I'll explain what is a bit more confusing. So we are aware now, Camden restarted the project in 1608. So a full 11 years after he originally was asked to write the history. And that's mainly because we're very lucky. He was a very sort of meticulous writer of his own life. So actually in his private papers, there just happens to be this amazing folio of basically, I want to say like over a dozen autobiographical bullet points about his life. And he just so happens in that little list, maybe he knew someone would be writing about him one day, said, in 1608, I began to compile my annals. And I think even just, so this was all written in Latin, but I think even just that phrase is interesting because what do we mean by compile? Does that mean were you getting more of your sources? Were you writing at this point? So that's still relatively vague. And what my job has been is by sort of really closely looking at the Faustina manuscripts, which have been relatively understudied by scholars before, we've kind of been able to actually figure out that timeline a little bit better. So it turns out that within these 4,000 pages, there are 29 unique date references where Camden specifically writes, this is the point that I've been editing, which is really, really cool because a lot of writers don't do that. Now I know why school teachers always said, date your work.
Yes.
It's so great, isn't it? To actually have someone date their work and say, I read this section of this history on this date. And so the earliest kind of editorial dates we have are from 1613 and the latest we have is from 1620, which is super interesting because the first part of Camden's Annals was published in 1615, and then the second part was published in 1625. And in the past, scholars thought that there might have been a delay in like the final part of the history being published because maybe Camden hadn't written it all in one go. But what we've been able to tell by going through these editorial dates is that there was definitely at least one full version of the history written by August 1613, which is super interesting because it means that the first part, which covered the years 1558 to 1588, being published in 1615. I mean, Camden had the rest of it written up. Just for whatever reason, it wasn't published on that date. So that's been super exciting. And then obviously, that maybe helps to explain why we have so many other dates from 1616 right the way through to 1620 in the manuscript, because maybe he'd written the first draft version of the later years of Elizabeth's life. But of course, that being kind of the most recent bit of history and probably the trickiest to navigate with all the sort of shenanigans that happened during that time, you can see that Camden was working very hard during those years to refine that history. So that's really exciting. And that's some of the sort of insights that we've been able to figure out about, when he was potentially writing and editing. And, I would argue that that was maybe when he finished, some of his work. But I think what's been more confusing for scholars is why he went back to the project. So we've talked a lot about, like the dates, but what brought him back? Cecil was dead, In theory, he would have never had to pick it up again. And traditionally, scholars have argued that actually the reason why Camden came back to it was because of a controversy with the French historian Jacques Auguste II and King James I of England. So King James came to the throne in 1603. And he was really, really desperate to kind of rectify the historical portrayal of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who we all know had a very difficult life and was unfortunately executed for treason against Elizabeth. And yet this was his mother, and he didn't feel like it was fair that she had such a negative historical portrayal. And so scholars have traditionally said that the reason why Camden came back to the work is that when everyone found out that Jacques Auguste II was writing his history, James had hoped that the French historian would be the person to finally, give a flattering portrayal to his mother, or at least a fairer portrayal. And supposedly he then asked Camden to be the person to send the information to Jacques Auguste II. But unfortunately, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So the correspondence reveals that actually originally, even before James got involved in all of this, Jacques Auguste II, being friends with Camden, had asked him for some advice about how to write about Mary, Queen of Scots. Because we've got to remember, in this period, history writing was dangerous, censorship was rife, and in Camden's annals itself, he documents many different situations where writers got into very deep, troubling consequences for writing things against the monarchy. So, for example, John Stubbs gets his right hand cut off for writing against the proposed match of Elizabeth I and Duke of Anjou. And then later on, John Hayward gets imprisoned in the Tower of London for simply writing a history that was supposedly meant to be the inspiration for the Earl of Essex's coup against Elizabeth. And, you can see when Camden's writing about these episodes in his history that he feels, that palpable fear that we are historians and whatever we write could affect our lives. We could get in trouble for it. And so when Jacques Auguste II first comes to Camden for advice, Camden urges him to write cautiously, to go the moderate path. And that's really interesting because Camden was aspiring to be like a classical historian, which was all about, telling the truth no matter what the consequences. And yet, because of the reality of the situation, in part of that letter, he's like, maybe you should follow King James's account as opposed to the other negative accounts. But then what ends up happening is that Jacques Auguste II does not follow Camden's advice, and he publishes rather negative portrayal of Mary and obviously gets into trouble with King James. And so then King James actually doesn't recruit Camden, but he recruits Camden's friend Cotton to send historical information to Jacques Auguste II about Mary, Queen of Scots. And then what becomes even more confusing is that in another letter at some point, Camden reveals that the basis of Cotton's materials were from his own annals. So you can see that it's very, very confusing. It looks like two friends were working on the same material at exactly the same time. And basically, it's still been a struggle, and it's still something that I'm trying to unpack now, figuring out to what extent that meant that how much was James kind of looking at the annals itself, or was it, mediated through Cotton's version? And so that's definitely complicated, but I hope to unravel that further, and you can read that in my thesis in a year's time.
Oh, I can't wait. That is absolutely fascinating, because I think there is still this general idea when we think about this history that it's William Camden sitting there by himself writing, if you know what I mean, where, we're going to talk a little bit more about whether he collaborated with anyone else or not.
Yes.
But
yes,
before we dive into that, so interesting. Do you mind telling us if you've come across anything that might suggest what sources Camden utilized when he was compiling or writing his history?
Yes. So in the preface itself, Camden actually talks both about Cecil and Cotton being really important for him in compiling his sources. So apparently Cecil, provided him with a lot of state papers, parliamentary records, because obviously, being Elizabeth's top guy, he had access to a lot of those sources. But also Cotton, at the same time, was a massive sort of collector in his own right. And he had a lot of documents, not only antiquarian things, which is how they ended up, finding the group that they did, but he also had some records from, Elizabeth's reign as well. And actually, we're so lucky that so much of the Cotton collection still survives in the British Library. So my last chapter, which I haven't quite started going into properly yet, is trying to identify some of those sources that still exist.
Wonderful.
And showing how they have been used directly in Camden's annals. But this is a very key question for scholars, because sometimes it's been argued that Camden's the first modern English historian, in the sense that, he writes that he is using primary sources, where in the past that wasn't necessarily important in history writing. It was all about just teaching virtue or, and how to like avoid vice. But yes, I think it'll be really important to see to what extent he is actually using the primary sources that he's supposedly saying he is, because that might affect how we kind of view his historiographical practices.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, we'll have to watch this space and be patient and give you time to work. And in terms of the actual history, how is it structured? Does he just follow sort of a chronological timeline, or are there other elements to it?
That's a great question. And there's a bit of a clue already in the name that it's called the Annals. In Latin, the official title is Annales Rerum Anglicarum et Hibernicarum Regnante Elizabetha.
It's a mouthful.
Translate. Yes, it is. And there's actually, as you know, with most early modern titles, there's so many other little
that's right.
So I just gave you the main one. And it translates to the annals of English and Irish affairs during the reign of Elizabeth. And the key is really in the word annals, because like the medieval chronicle, basically Camden structured his history year by year chronologically. So from the very first of Elizabeth's reign right until the end. And what's really interesting, and this is what kind of brought me to the project originally, is that in his preface, he explains that he followed this particular format because this was the format used by the ancient Roman historian Tacitus, who lived in the 1st century AD under the Emperor Domitian. And he became one of the most famous sort of historians of his era and even during the Renaissance. And I find it particularly interesting that Camden decides to talk about his influence so openly, because Tacitus was actually interpreted in many contradictory ways during the early modern period. So you could have two authors completely giving opposite interpretations of Tacitus. On the one hand, he could be used to espouse Republican ideals and down with the monarchy, but other authors managed to use his work to say, well, no, actually, this is why absolute monarchy is important, And I think what's fascinating about Camden is I've been really trying to figure out, not only from his preface, but from his works, to what extent is his ode to Tacitus in the preface just, lip service, or is he actually kind of using certain techniques that Tacitus did? And I'm basically trying to figure out, what angle is he using Tacitus? Does he have some sort of political leanings more to the Republican side, or is he using him as a way to kind of defend the monarchy? So that's been really interesting. And what I will say is that Camden, being the educated scholar he was and being so pragmatic and aware of the situation, I think he was very clever in whenever he did kind of make allusions to Tacitus, he kept it open-ended.
Right.
I feel like you could read into it how you wanted to. And I think a lot of scholars were doing that because it was such a dangerous situation. But I think that's why it's so important to study his text in the original, because there have been times actually where people have mistaken, classical allusions as Camden's own words. That is obviously dangerous, at times, because you think that he's saying something original and actually it's Tacitus or the Greek historian Polybius who wrote that, and that could really change your interpretation of the entire narrative. So yeah, I think it's interesting that he says, I'm structuring it in an analytic format because of Tacitus, but then where does that lead? Like, what else is he kind of changing through that lens?
Oh, absolutely fascinating. And as you've said, you've been studying the original manuscripts in the British Library. How wonderful. And you've used, and I'm not sure if, there's a team that's worked with you or not, but certainly some specialist images have been made of the manuscripts. And perhaps some of our listeners have heard of some of the exciting finds that have already been publicized. So a number of hidden passages. So can you tell us a little bit about how this was uncovered and what was uncovered, and why were these passages hidden or censored?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And I will sort of start by emphasizing that actually, while it's been one of the most exciting discoveries of my PhD journey so far, it's so important for, I think, all the listeners to know that even though we have discovered hidden pages, every single page of the manuscripts contains crossings outs and corrections.
Yes.
And there's evidence of self-censorship pretty much on every single page, or, we'll talk a little bit about using the word self-censorship versus editing. But I think it's really important to know that this whole history is evidence of just reworking. Yeah. And there's still so much to discover, because I will not be able to tackle 4,000 pages in the entire project so far. But I hope, people will be encouraged to look at them themselves, because eventually, obviously, the entire digitized sort of manuscripts will be made available online and people can look themselves. But now to actually talk about the hidden pages themselves. So basically, during the first year of my PhD, I thought it'd be a good idea to catalogue these manuscripts to figure out more about their, material composition. And it was, during that kind of cataloguing process that I kind of realised that about 200 pages had slips of paper covering some of the text underneath, and they were glued on. So of course, any scholar that had been looking at these, in the past probably were just as interested as me and my team in seeing what was underneath, but they didn't have the technology to, do that without damaging the manuscripts themselves. You're not going to rip, the paper off to see what's underneath. But of course, now through the use of transmitted light photography and specialist imaging, and basically the digitization team at the British Library did happen to uncover original text that no one had seen in 400 years. And they made it legible for us to see. So that's been absolutely fascinating. And what I will say is that when the sort of finds were first publicized, I'd only, managed to kind of look at them from a very top-down perspective because it hadn't been that long. And fortunately, I've had many more months since then. And I will say that just like with any sort of research, your findings end up and your conclusions end up changing. Yes. So what I will say is that we have, discovered some incredible details that no one has ever known. But would I now say that, the primary function of these slips of paper was self-censorship? Maybe not necessarily. I think I would actually argue that their primary function was broader in a sort of editorial process for restructuring his work. Because while sometimes the slips of paper come at very important points of the narrative, sometimes they are just completely, random episode. And quite frankly, it'll be the case where, there was a really messy draft underneath, and Camden, being the sort of perfectionist he was like, I don't want to read this anymore. And he would literally just write the neater version on top. So of course, that's not really a self-censorship thing. It's just an editing thing. But I think that's still fascinating because we've got to remember, our editing process is so different today. We've got, Microsoft Word to cut, copy and paste things in a blink of an eye. They did not have access to that. And so it was a very laborious task. And it meant that, instead of wanting to write out a draft again and again, sometimes it made more sense to just cover up old sections that didn't make sense anymore. And, you would paste something on top. But that being said, the great thing for us as historians is that maybe certain things might have not felt important to Camden, in kind of keeping for the record, but we've discovered some really cool things that no one has been able to see as a result. So, one of my favorite examples is the obituary of King Philip II of Spain, who is Elizabeth's arch nemesis. And, the original hidden sort of text of that reveals that Camden was literally going to say that he had no imperial skills. He was quite scathing about this king. And what's then fascinating is that on the slip on top, all of those sort of details disappear. But equally, what's been super important is not to just take that hidden page in a vacuum. You have to compare it to all the other drafts that exist of that. And I will say that most events, there are at least 5 different versions in the manuscript. Yeah. And actually you see self-censorship not only, with these slips, but actually in those drafts as they change over time. And so, for example, another fascinating detail that we've discovered is that right up until, publication, Camden was going to also reveal the way that King Philip died, which was in a very gruesome manner. He had a disease called theriasis, which supposedly caused massive pustules to erupt all over the body and erupt with lice. And, it was seen as a form of divine punishment at the time. And considering that Camden wanted to follow classical historiographical ideals, I wonder if whether, he decided right at the end to cross that out so that it wouldn't go into the printed version, because he thought, well, that's not a very dignified way to describe the death of the king. He was very, adamant. We can see this in the preface where he says, I don't want to speak too badly of my enemies or too well of my heroes, because that's not the role of a historian. And so, yeah, there's been so many instances like that where, thanks to this hidden text, not only have we been able to discover more about Camden's physical process writing as a historian, but we have discovered all these amazing little details that we wouldn't have otherwise. Before this, it wasn't at all completely certain how King Philip died. And there are many instances like this. So I feel very lucky that we've had this opportunity, and it was generously funded by the British Library's Collection Trust. And yeah, can't wait for the public to see the results for themselves.
That is so absolutely so fascinating. The content is fascinating, but I mean, as you've said, that process of editing that we don't often get to see, and we can see it here. I think that's so interesting. So what other things can we actually glean from this close analysis of those handwritten manuscripts? Anything in terms of authorship, collaboration, anything like that?
Yes. We've been teasing that out slowly.
We have.
But, this is exactly what, these are the questions that have been fueling my project. And so with the Faustina manuscripts, the question of authorship and that collaboration between Camden and Cotton has been really, really important. Because actually there are several different handwritings in the manuscripts. And, you might assume that because we constantly talk about Camden being the primary author, that his hand is the predominant hand in the text. But that's not true because obviously, back then many people had scribes. And so what we find is that a lot of the hands I've still yet to identify actually. So the main text is often written by an unidentified hand as of yet. But what is fascinating is because we know Camden's handwriting so well, it's obvious that he is the primary editor of the text because every single page we see him scrawling in the margins, a correction or over, he's crossing out text and writing on the top. And he was absolutely so detail oriented where sometimes it's a correction as small as, oh, that's a lowercase letter. No, that should be a capital letter. Or it'll be, changing a verb from the past tense to the present tense.
Right.
He was so invested in that process. So that's brilliant because, we see that his handwriting on every part of the manuscript. So that probably makes sense. You'd like to think that perhaps, he was dictating and then when it came to actually reading it back, he decided to do that with his own hand. And then obviously, actually, we've talked a lot about Cotton's contribution to the work. And what's really interesting is, again, that his handwriting does appear, but it's not as frequently as you might think. And again, that could be maybe just explained by the fact that he would have used scribes himself. But there are certain instances where actually his hand does appear and it's at very, important moments of narrative. So for example, it's mainly actually when Mary Queen of Scots is involved. So for example, when the text is talking about her death and her execution, you literally see Cotton making some very interesting edits. So it does show you that, whilst we can't say for certain who was writing the main text from scratch, both of these men were very involved in that editing process. And actually another handwriting that's been sort of identified, which was a complete shock to me, was that of Sir Francis Bacon, which is so random in some ways, except that of course they were all, scholars and interested in history writing. And I guess because we've got to remember, this was a history of recent times. There's a letter actually from Bacon to Cotton in April 1610, where he says, I'm attaching a couple of corrections for the drafts because you need to correct some details about my father, Nicholas Bacon. But then what's interesting about that is that if he's writing that to Cotton in 1610, how early was Cotton, involved in this process of the annals? So, it's absolutely fascinating. There's still a lot more work to do. But I think if I can say that the main thing that I'm happy with realizing is that these men were very much involved in that editing process, that makes me happy. And I hope that, as the work continues, we'll be able to figure out even further who exactly was writing what and why.
Isn't that interesting? I had no idea about Sir Francis Bacon. That's really fascinating. And so you talked about earlier the fact that this is later published. So these are the handwritten manuscripts you're studying. And then we have the publication in 1615 you mentioned, which I believe is in Latin, that one. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
And then 1625 in English?
No, so actually that's where, again, it gets a little bit confusing because final sort of part of the Latin history is published in 1625. And then the first English translation, which is incomplete, also appears in 1625. Written by a man called Abraham Darcy, which it's not my favorite translation because he actually is translating from a French translation of the Latin version. So it's very removed from the original. And it's only then in 1630 that an official complete translation by history appears by Robert Norton. And I would then, it's Norton's translation that I would advise readers to go and peruse. But that being said, because all the manuscripts are in Latin and because we know from Camden's private correspondence that he actually didn't want the annals to be published in English during his lifetime because he said, quote, knowing how unjust carpers the unlearned readers are. That sounds really elitist to us, but we've got to remember that back then, anyone who was educated knew Latin and Greek like, the back of their hand. And with the fact that he was so influenced by classical authors, I believe that he wanted to keep people reading it in the original Latin so that a lot of these allusions and these kind of interesting interpretations were, could stay in people's minds. Because obviously translating, isn't an unbiased practice. And some scholars have argued, actually, like Patrick Collinson has stated that Norton's translation is correct in many ways, but equally, he clearly was a massive fan of Elizabeth. So sometimes where Camden is a little bit more, kind of in the middle ground, the translation has kind of given us that Gloriana perspective of her that maybe Camden didn't originally want to have. And, that's why I found it so important to go through the manuscript and each draft version from scratch, because the truth is that, not only is it important to read it in the Latin, but we're talking about a 20-year process of Camden changing his mind. And so I do get the sense that, you sometimes glean more insight into his own actual opinions when you look at the first draft, because that's at a point where maybe he wasn't even being subject to kind of King James at that point. A good example of this, for example, is the death and obituary of Elizabeth I. First version of it is very focused on Elizabeth and how no one will ever be able to detract from her glory. And then what we find is that as, the different drafts progress, there's a slip of paper that gets added in, which suddenly talks all about how, Elizabeth appointed James her successor on her deathbed in this very dramatic first-hand speech, where we don't have, evidence of this anywhere else. And you kind of think, well, maybe Camden added this later once he realized that, James was getting involved in this history. And then it gets to a point where right at the end, the last draft that we have, Camden kind of removes his own authorial voice and he literally says, I'm not going to say anything that her successor hasn't said about her.
Right.
So I think that's why it's so important to not only read his original Latin, but the Latin in the manuscripts, because you really do see potentially that shift, that transition of him being more confident in his own authorial opinion to slowly but surely being aware of the, situation that, if he publishes this under his own name, he could get into trouble with his superiors. And so later on, he becomes a bit more of a mouthpiece for James, to be honest. So yeah. Really, really interesting.
Wow, what a story. And so can I just clarify, sorry to keep harping on about manuscripts, but so how many drafts are there in manuscript form then?
That's a brilliant question, because basically, like I said, it's a year-by-year account of Elizabeth's reign. So the way that I've been able to kind of compile and document how many drafts exist is by looking at how many times each chapter appears. What's really interesting is that for the most part, there's 2 to 5 different versions of each chapter.
Oh, God.
And sometimes the change is minuscule and it'll be just some like grammatical amendments. But other times we're talking about Camden literally crossing out 10 pages and then rewriting a whole thing. So yeah, this is why I sometimes think this might end up becoming my life's work, because there's just so much to do. Yeah. But what is incredibly curious and fascinating to me is that there's only one chapter in the history, but only one draft survives. And that is 1587, which is the same year that obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, got executed. And I think that's absolutely fascinating, because if there's so many other draft versions that survive of the other years, it's obvious that Camden didn't write this once. There must have been other drafts, but then we have to speculate, like, were they destroyed because they were too...
Is this the official one that was kind of
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely fascinating, especially when you look to his private correspondence with like Jacques Auguste II from years earlier, and you can see that he feels very nervous about how to advise his friend on how to write Mary. So I'm sure he probably spent many of, his hours trying to figure out how exactly to craft this. But unfortunately, we don't have access to that. And that will just be a tantalizing bit of history that, unless maybe in 100 years, someone will have found, that draft. But so far, we just have to accept that we only have one draft version of that year, which is really cool.
Wow, that's incredible, the work you're doing. I think it's so interesting and fascinating. I have one more question, sorry, that just popped into my head. In terms of the part 1 and part 2 that are published in the Latin that we spoke about, so are these copies that Camden would have seen and approved, or are there also differences with those first Latin publications and his manuscripts? Now that you've said there's so many drafts, there's probably some differences.
Thank you so much. That's a really, really important question, because I need to clarify that Camden was alive when the first part was published in 1615, but Camden died in 1623. Okay. And then the second part was only published 2 years after his death. So what I've been trying to work out is to what extent, was he planning to kind of republish those earlier chapters that were already out there, and whether he wanted to edit those as well in the sort of later publication.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will say is that we're very lucky that in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there is a printed version of the 1615 edition with some actual edits in Camden's hand, which is
Wow,
fascinating.
that's
So
incredible.
clearly, being the meticulous scholar he was, I mean, like I said, he republished the Britannia 6 times, and he kept adding new things because he just had more things to say. So yeah, I do think absolutely that those drafts and that kind of printed book with his own amendments are in there, because had he survived, perhaps he would have in his own right republished that first part of his history with
Mm-hmm.
maybe even more different
More
details.
different. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is interesting that while he was still alive, and there's so much correspondence where people were already very happy with this first part of the history, and they kept asking, when is the second part coming? When is the second part coming? And you can tell that he's just deflecting. And that's probably because being the most sort of contentious part of Elizabeth's reign, where so many people were still alive that, had witnessed some of
Right.
the
Yeah.
terrible things, that I personally think there was a reason why he was quite happy to wait until he died.
So where does the first part end? Where does the first part finish?
Yeah, so it's 1558 to 1588. That's pretty much wrapping up the arc of Mary's life.
Yes.
And then, it's only in 1625 that you get 1589 to 1603, where there's a lot going on in those years. So
there is. Yeah. That is so interesting. Oh my goodness. I cannot wait to read your finished work. No pressure, of course. We'll all be just waiting patiently. Absolutely fascinating. And I think, again, it shows the importance of going back to the original sources whenever we can. I know, obviously, you're an expert in Latin. Not all of us are an expert in Latin. Yeah. So that's wonderful that you're doing sort of the hard yards for us and then sharing the information. I'm so grateful. And I really can't wait to hear more. This is such an exciting project. And I'm so grateful that you came on the show to tell us about it. But I can't let you go just yet. I have just some other fun questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, what is a book that you're currently reading or a book that you've recently finished?
So actually, because of my classical roots, I've been reading Stephen Fry's latest sort of rendition of the Odyssey, just because I can't help it. It's something that I grew up on as a child, and I love epics and myths and things like that. So I got gifted the book for Christmas, and it's just been my little sort of unwinding bedtime read, and it's just been so wonderful to kind of relive those stories that I grew up with. And yeah, I'm always keeping one foot in my sort of Tudor books, but also with my classics, because I love my classics.
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes you need a break, don't you, from what you're spending every day researching. You're like, goodbye, Camden, I need something else. What about when you're writing and researching? Do you have any rituals that you like to sort of follow?
Yeah, I classic person that if I don't have a cup of tea next to me, I can't really start to write. I have those sort of rituals, that's how I kind of get myself sorted. But I also actually recently started something that's been really beneficial to me, that I've started journaling a little bit before and after sessions of writing, because I think there can sometimes be a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves for kind of getting, a certain piece of text done. And if that doesn't happen, you can go away feeling really stressed and anxious. And so what I've started to try to do is actually kind of write more about the process of writing. I think sometimes you need to free write a little bit, right, before you can really get the sort of nitty gritty down. And so that's been really great. So I just do a 5-minute free write before a writing session, and then I do a 5-minute free write afterwards, kind of just reflecting on how it went. And it means that whenever I, next go back to a session, I can just kind of see, what my thoughts were at the time. And that's been really, really helpful.
And that's probably so good, because you're not then looking at a blank page. You can sort of reread that, and it kind of kicks you into the mode.
It's just like it's a gentle way to ease yourself back into work.
Oh, I love that. And do you have a newsletter or something? Are you on Substack or somewhere where people can read about?
I don't currently have anything like that. You can find me on X at Helena Heritage. So I'm posting on there. It will just happen sometimes on the day that a fun fact will come out, and I'll put something out there. But my plan is hopefully after the thesis to kind of get more stuff out there. I've got an article currently in the works. I'd love to write a book about all of this one day. So yeah, I think you
should. And what about a film that you have watched more than once? A favorite film?
Oh, that's a really good question. I love films so much that I have a letterbox account. I don't know if you've heard of this sort of app that basically it's just a movie review app where you can kind of log all the films that you watched and write little reviews. But it makes me think that I don't tend to rewatch a lot of things unless it's something like a rom-com from my like adolescence, like just for like a comfort watch. So I love just like finding new things, and I put it all on my letterbox so I don't forget, because once you watch as many films as I do, you can sometimes forget. So it's a good little app for that, actually.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't heard of that. So there you go. I'm normally with the book apps, but that's a good one for us film buffs as well.
An app for everything now, isn't there?
There is an app for everything, absolutely. And what about an ideal Friday night? What does that look like for you?
So it depends how introverted or extroverted I'm feeling. So sometimes that is just going to the pub with some friends and talking about, our weeks and what's been going on. But equally, I love a little Netflix binge. So I was already saying that I watch a lot of films, but I also love a lot of series. And, it's just about, for me, just being able to relax after a hard week and just kind of escape into different stories. And so that to me, is one of
both of those options sound really good. I like them. And what about a new skill that you might like to learn?
So actually, something that I've been trying more recently is to get into some more craft skills. I'm not particularly good with my hands, but I have some amazing friends who are great at embroidery and crocheting and things like that. So we've been meeting up recently at, a semi-regular basis to kind of swap skills, and it's just such a wholesome activity. So I've been really, really enjoying that. And who knows, maybe one day I'll even be able to do my own clothes. I've managed to crochet a scarf. But,
that's pretty good.
We'll see.
That is pretty good. And what about if you're supposed to be working, but you're not feeling very inspired? What do you do to get yourself into that more creative mode?
So actually, I'm really lucky that here in Oxford, I live very close to Christchurch Meadow, which is just an absolutely beautiful little sort of bit of nature in otherwise, quite a busy sort of touristy city. And so whenever I'm just stuck, I will literally force myself out to go for a walk, and I will just, have a very mindful walk. So really just kind of, instead of trying to kind of figure out a problem, I will just try and look at my surroundings and really just kind of let go of everything, because I sometimes find that the best ideas come to you kind of spontaneously. Not when you're really trying really hard to find them. So I just try to ground myself in something completely different. And then, eventually I'll come back, try that journaling process, and we'll see where it takes me.
Yeah, I love that. Nature, it's the best. Absolutely the best. And what about your favorite season and why?
Oh, that's a good question. So I love summer because I love the sun. I take vitamin D tablets in the winter because, in England, we need that here. So I absolutely love the summer. And so, I, being so close to Christchurch Meadow, I had such a beautiful, like, sort of working summer here last year where, I would go to the library, during the afternoons, but in the evenings I'd have picnics out, by the river. And I love those long summer days where you can just soak in the sun. So, yeah.
Yeah, that does sound absolutely perfect. And last question for you. What is a great piece of advice, and this doesn't have to be anything to do with history, that you've been given or that you've heard or that you've read that you can share with us?
So I am a big advocate of like looking after your mental health. And so I struggled with like anxiety and depression in my life. And one thing I would say is that, nothing is as important as your health. So something that really kind of changed my life is when you get too stressed, it's easy to think, well, I need to do this, this and that. But really for me, it's been finding out those like grounding techniques to kind of bring me back down to earth. And just, my biggest advice is that if you're struggling, find a mental health sort of activity that will help you, be that therapy or these sort of grounding techniques, because it's so important to look after yourself. So that's my big takeaway on life, really.
Yeah, no, I love it. And in these times that we're living in, I think it's great advice for all of us, to be honest. So thank you so much for sharing that. And the very last thing I promise is the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Yeah, I've loved listening to some of them. And my Tudor takeaway is this beautiful illustrated book called A Secretary Hand ABC book, written by Alf Eisen. And the reason why I'm recommending this is that prior to kind of getting into Tudor history, my secretary hand skills were not particularly great. And obviously a lot of old documents are written in a very different kind of alphabet than we're used today. I am actually lucky that Camden's Annals itself is written in italic hand, so I think anyone would be able to read them. But a lot of the sources he's working with are in secretary hand. And so this is just a beautiful, tiny book with lots of illustrations, and it's basically an ABC of how those letters are written in secretary hand. And there's even practice transcriptions at the end. So it's very cost effective, and it's just helped me so much along my path. So that's my little takeaway.
Oh, I love that. And do you know what? We've never had that one in all the episodes I've done over the years. So good on you. That's amazing. And I love it. I feel that I'm going to have to Google it and find a copy for myself. Oh, amazing. And this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you again so much for joining me on the podcast and sharing a little bit about your research.
And thank you so much for inviting me, Natalie. I've just had the best time.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.